Excellent. Thank you. And we only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to have to like kind of book here, which is good. I think short talks are probably better and a little punchier. So I'm here to talk about why X is so damn hard on open source projects. And I totally understand that I am not well known in the community. And so like, why listen to me? You know, I work for the bad guys. You know, I work for the for-profit companies and so forth. So I understand that I'm not necessarily coming with the strongest open source pedigree. But I would also like to say that I'm not here to talk about money, right? I'm here to talk about UX, a basic skill that I hope applies to a wide range of things. And so even though I don't have decades of experience in open source, I do believe that you can take a lot of what I'm saying and apply it to open source communities. And besides, I think Pablo Picasso said it best, you know, good artists borrow, great artists steal. So I hope that my experience in UX can be something that can be totally ripped off and used and by the open source community. So I'm looking forward to seeing ways in which we can kind of have our worlds kind of work better together. Um, so what I do want to talk about is that I have tried. I've actually worked over the last couple of years on some open source projects and trying to transition over into that model of how I can contribute, how I can help. So I've actually volunteered on 3 separate open source projects, and they've all been kind of disasters. And when I talked to other open source, to other UX people, they're kind of like, yeah, I've had that same problem too. And so it was kind of interesting that kind of behind the scenes, everybody kind of was getting this, that it was not working as well as it should have. And so I figured like, let's talk about exploring what's going on, what's happening, and how can we like make this work better. But I really want to stress this has got to be a discussion. I'm not here to like drop the mic and say that what I'm saying is perfect. I'm just here to explain the troubles I've had. I'm going to offer some solutions. And I'm pretty sure I'm probably going to say some things that are against possibly community approaches in open source. But please, let's talk about that. Yeah, I have the wrong approach, or there's a better way of doing it. That's what we're all about. We're about here to grow and learn together as a community. So a couple of assumptions before we get out this out of the way is that not all FOSS projects need UX help. Let's be clear. Some are very technical, some are very low term. I'm only referring to the ones that are more consumer focused, you know, more normal users that are not deeply technical. So there's obviously a subset here. The other one I'm talking about is I don't want to name names. The 3 projects I worked on are all fairly well known. My goal is not to name and shame. And from my understanding, what I discovered is really common in a lot. So there's no value in talking about the projects that I was on. And the last one is that not all FOSS projects have bad UX. I mean, things like Elementary, the Linux distro, is excellent. It has a very strong team with good leadership and so forth. So there's a lot of good things happening in open source. But I almost would argue that the open source projects that have good UX are kind of the exception that proves the rule. So there's this rough diagram I'll use here about the UX world overlapping with open source. And yeah, indeed, that there are this overlap that's working well, and these guys are fine. But the real question to me is, why is this area so darn large? Why is it that we're having so much trouble? So let's take that apart a little bit. So here was my first. I have 3 different stories of projects I worked on, and I'm going to tell you. So I was this naive young UX pup trying really hard to help, and so I went to a website. And I was just listening to some of the earlier talks that people were mentioning, and how a lot of projects don't make it easy for people to contribute, whether they're open UX people or not. So I went there, and there was like no list, there was no roadmap, there was no list of UX tasks. I mean, there was like, I wanted to help, but I didn't know where to start. So I just went to the forum. I just posted, hey, I'm a UX designer. What can I do? Because there was nothing for me to find in the repo itself, which kind of worried me. And the response was really quick and friendly, like, oh, hey, you're here. Awesome. We need icons. And I'm like, really? I mean, I'm happy to do icons, but there's so many more important things to do. And when I've talked to other UX designers, they're like, that's all anybody wants. The only thing open source projects want is icons or some visual thing. And it's just like, really, and it feels like we're being seen through this very narrow lens. It's If you're more of a programmer, imagine if all anyone ever wanted to talk to you about was unit tests. It's kind of how we feel. Like, sure, they're important, happy to do it, but there's so much more to talk about. And so I'm just trying to frame it in a way that if you're more programmatically mindset, you'll understand the frustration. So let's kind of use this experience that I had about icons being the only thing that's involved in the UX for a project as kind of our organizing principle for this talk. Because I think there's three separate things we can talk about. There's like this definition of what is UX. There's the actual tools that we use in open source projects. And there's the actual culture of open source. And all three of these overlap right now to only allow this very narrow thing called icons. It's kind of understandable that all we can do is icons when we contribute. And the goal is to say, like, well, how can we just give this a little bit of a nudge? How can we grow this so that it's not just icons, but we can talk about flow diagrams, journey maps. We can talk about user research, user studies, and so forth to expand the toolkit of what open source needs and can do for UX type of work. So in every section that I do here, I'm going to have a little summary slide which says this is what we're doing today, and let's aspire to what we're going to do tomorrow. So you'll see this 3 times throughout my talk. So the first question is, what is UX? Let's talk about I don't think people really deeply understand what UX is. And if I had to be pushed to say what one word summarizes the goal of UX, is I'd say be perspective. The whole idea is that your product is a huge, big, giant thing, and there's a lot it can do and a lot can be. And how do you prioritize things? And the whole idea is that by understanding your users, understanding their tasks, and more importantly, understanding the pain that they're trying to solve by using your software, you can start to get a perspective of what you should be focusing on, what's important, how it fits with other things. And that's the guiding principle of UX, is to provide that perspective. And whenever I often talk to some people, they often feel like this is some touchy-feely bullshit where you just kind of want to chat with folks and have a drink and just write a bunch of notes and put some sticky notes on the wall and yeah, that's just for, And I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually a very hard-nosed, business-minded way of making decisions. It's about creating some difficult questions that need to be answered that allow you to actually prioritize your work. UX is at its best when it helps you trim your workload, not make it more. So it's often, I think, common for people to quote the Cathedral of the Bazaar, kind of the founding document of open source. And I understand that things have moved on a little bit, but I do found, when I read it, I found it really striking that some of those feelings, momentum seems to be carried out today. So here's a quote. Treating your users as co-developers is your least hassle route of rapid code improvement and effective debugging. I don't doubt that. It probably is the least hassle route. But the problem is it promotes a certain type of thinking that your developers are your users. And that's, of course, fundamentally not what UX is about. The people that are doing the programming, great people, nothing wrong with them. They're probably on the power user scale of things, but they aren't your typical users. And it's really important for you to expand how you think about this. So I'm just saying is that the heritage of open source has encouraged this. And I'd like to see that it's growing and changing, is just a legacy that we have to address. So the way I phrase this is that there's 4 layers of UX, what I kind of call the understanding, bridging, flowing, and refining. And there's just layers of tasks that UX accomplish that works its way from a broad understanding down to a much more targeted one. So for things like understanding, you do user tests and focus groups and surveys and interviews and personas. You're just trying to understand the pain that people are in and why they need your software. And it's more important not just simply to understand how your software's functions help them, but what context they are in that needs your software. So often projects don't understand that their software doesn't really, bridge that gap, which is the next section, which is bridging, which is to then understand what is your core tech offering? What is easy about it? What is hard about it? What is it good at? And as I advise startup companies and other things, I often advise them that just because you have a solution doesn't mean it is the right solution. And so often, what you really need is like a preamble technology, a way of onboarding them, a way of kind of helping them out to really get to the meat of your program. And understanding that flow really helps really solve the problem for them properly. Flowing is though more what you start thinking about as kind of classic UX, where you're building the screens and you're flowing people through. You have the sign up flow, you have the error dialogues, you have, the what happens when you click on OK versus cancel. It's a very much a kind of a directed flow that gets to the specifics of your application. And then the refining is the last little bit, which is talking about having design systems, color themes, animations, the nuts and the bolts, the actual visual design. And yes, way at the bottom, at the very bottom of this list is icons. So yes, they are there, they exist, but it's kind of the last thing that you do compared to everything else. And so what I'm trying to show here is that there's this rich catalog of tools that UX brings to open source, and they're all about creating shared vocabulary. It's not meant to be hidden, it's not meant to be esoteric. We're building things that the whole team should be looking at and talking about. In fact, good UX is done by a team, not by the UX people themselves. So in summary, what I want to say is that open source has had this history of saying, I am the user, and maybe it grows to say maybe the GitHub users are the users. And the whole purpose of UX is to discover the user, gather the right information to prototype and test shared decisions. So I'm going to keep moving along quickly because I'm afraid I'm running out of time. FOSS tools is the next point to talk about. And the classic example here, of course, is this saying that, give a man a hammer and every problem becomes a nail. And the hammer in the situation is Git. I mean, just everything seems to be colored by what Git is or its related siblings. Oh, thank you. Is about what time about what Git is capable of doing. So as I mentioned before, there's this understanding, bridging, flowing, refining, which is this process of understanding users at a high level, understanding the technology, making sure it's appropriate, and then coming up with the flows and the details to deliver to users. And that tends to create this iteration loop where you do this research, you prototype something up quickly, you figure out what's going on, you test it, and then you discuss it, and then you go back around this loop again. It's this iterative flow, because the fundamental point is you don't know what you don't know. And so this idea of building these things quickly and rapidly, like paper prototypes sometimes, allows you to understand so much more and gives you that focus that you need to figure out what your product needs to be. The problem is that this generates diagrams and personas and all sorts of stuff that doesn't really fit. And what does Git want? Well, Git just wants files, right? They just want text files or JPEGs or something that you can kind of check in. So it's not a surprise at all that when an open source project wants UX, of course they want icons. It's understandable, right? It's effectively, they only ask for the work that fits this tool chain. So I'm very empathetic to the fact that projects want icons. I'm just saying is let's broaden this out a little bit. So what I mean by things like this is like personas or journey maps or user testing. These are documents and presentations and things that, yes, they can be turned into documents, but they aren't usually the thing that you check into a GitHub repo. So I believe this is the kind of stuff that you need to have. You need to have it be a part of your project and figure out ways of having it. So let me my second story, and this is still part of this FOSS tools section of the talk, is my second try, which was I was working with a project and I got them to have an issue, and we opened up an issue that the team wanted to work on. And I then started doing my prototyping. I did it as an animated GIF. I got it on board. And so I was getting them to expand and to kind of not just simply check in files. And the proposal was, hey, here's my first prototype. I just want to talk about it. Here's what I'm doing. And the first response I got was, if you do that, I will leave this project. I'm like, whoa. I'm like, what just happened, right? And then the moderators were kind of like, well, that's just Steve, he does that. And I just thought it was really fascinating that, again, you seem to get this kind of drama a lot in some projects. And as a UX designer, I had to step back a little bit and say, you know what? GitHub issues is not the same as team discussions. And that's what I'm trying to do about team discussions here, is to understand and talk about this to form a coherent discussion that the team shares, right? So I would argue that there's a little bit of like George Orwell newspeak going on. The tools limit what we're capable of doing. And if all we can do is chat in little tiny asynchronous ASCII blurbs, we're not going to have the kind of meaningful human connection that generates community, fosters respect, encourages tolerance, slows down decision making a little bit so that people can then understand and think about it. So I'm just referring to how we can communicate in a richer way that's not just simply little ASCII blurbs back and forth. So the friction to me comes from the fact that we are remote. A lot of open source teams are remote, but all we're using is ASCII in these messages, and we don't seem to have a strong personal connection. And there doesn't seem to be a set of shared UX goals. So not surprisingly, when someone posts something, you get a table flip. And so I believe this is a function of how GitHub works, and we need to talk about this. So remember, I totally get that there's that a lot of open source teams are remote, and this, by the way, applies to all remote teams. It's not just open source. All I'm saying is let's bring it to the light. Let's talk about it. Let's say that this is a source of some of our friction and figure out ways to fix it. So in summary for this second section is, I believe there's a tyranny of tools. Git defines what's important. It tends to prioritize files, so not a surprise. All people want is icons. And the remote text discussion doesn't encourage teamwork or shared understanding or just simply having a little bit of understanding and trust amongst users. And so it's so easy for things to break down. So I think these two things need to be expanded as well. And so what you do in the UX community is you've got diagrams and discussions, and you have war rooms, you put things up on the wall and so forth. I understand that's hard for remote teams, but how can we get more of that? What does Miro offer to the discussion? So I think we need to just basically open our eyes to tools and communication and more team building. My final point is culture. And this is another quote from Cathedral and the Bazaar, that every good work of software starts by scratching a developer's personal itch. And what this seems to devolve into is everyone works on what they think is important. And unfortunately, this can kind of just create chaos, because it's kind of like every person for themselves. And the whole goal here is to develop a team shared community. And I understand this is volunteer. You can't tell anybody what to do. This is a very different thing than working on a corporate situation, which means you have to work even harder. You have to create effectively some shared values, some shared goals, so the team can work better together. And so often people think that UX designers are this guy. We're here to chastise, to say no, to be grumpy. It's like, no, quite the opposite. I see UX as like a CFO for a corporation. Probably a bad metaphor for open source, but bear with me for a second. The whole idea of a CFO is that they are there to actually do a lot of financial tasks. But when you talk to the CEO speaks finance. He understands the finance. He just trusts the CFO to go do stuff. And then the CFO offers him choices. You can do this or this or this. But they have a lingua franca. And I think that the intention here is that UX is the same way with the project lead. It's not about the fact that the UX person is there to tell the project lead what you have to do, but the project lead has to trust the UX person to go do some research, to create some things, and then the UX person has to trust that the project lead understands UX, knows what's important, understands the value of user testing and so forth, and you have this teamwork. So the UX person delivers a lot of choices and information to the project lead, and then the team makes a good choice. So it's not enough to throw a UX person at a project. The project lead has to get UX so that you can have this kind of teamwork together. That's what I'm trying to push for here. And so Steve Jobs is famous for saying real artists ship, but the reason you ship is because you can say no. And saying no is said for lots of good reasons. You don't have the time, you don't have the resources, but UX helps you also say no as well, because you can prioritize the features that have the biggest impact. And that has to be a team decision. That can't be the UX person. No is only possible if the entire team gets UX. And so that's my goal here, is to talk about leveling up UX in the open source group so that everybody is kind of on the same wavelength. So in general, the idea here is that a lot of open source is about my opinion, and the whole idea is to move more towards my goals. So here's my closing slide. I think I've got just a few minutes left. I've talked about what is UX, I've talked about the impact of tools, I've talked about the culture and the lack of it being a team sport. And so I just want to recommend, again, let's steal some things here to figure out what we can do for open source. From the what is UX point of view, I'd say do a user study. They're not hard to do. They're fairly easy and cheap to do. I mean, it's hard with the pandemic right now, but you can start doing some things remotely. Just get that into your culture. Do it and then see what happens and then discuss the results. That's an easy baby step you can take. As far as a team sport goes, create a UX hit list. GitHubs are notoriously bad at not showing their roadmap. Have a UX roadmap. This is what we're trying to do. These are the goals. It will spur conversation. It will get people talking. They'll probably change it, which is good, but at least you're having this conversation about why. What's the map? Where are you trying to go? So creating a section, it will attract UX people. They'll understand that they're valued, and you'll pull in more people automatically. It's a simple, cheap thing for you to do. And the other one about impact of tools, this is a harder one. I don't want to oversimplify it, but get more animations, have some more reports, post some things for discussion, and then try to discuss in real time if at all possible. Obviously have a code of conduct and enforce that, but talk to real people, become friends, engage with each other, because that will build the teamwork that you need to have the more difficult conversations. So I'm just here to start a discussion. I hope we can keep talking about this, and I hope people reach out to me afterwards, because I want to figure out what are next steps. So if anybody has some ideas of things they'd like to see done, any more projects I can help out on to discuss, please get a hold of me. My contact is all right here. I'm on Twitter. Here's my email address. And I just want to thank Toby and Jan for reviewing this talk a couple months ago. They were the ones who gave me some good talks. So thank you very much. I don't know if we have time for any questions, but feel free to reach out to me in an email if you'd like. Thank you.
Yes, we do have time for a question or two, Scott. Also, everybody, let's give Scott a warm thank you and a round of applause.
Thank you.
So if you have questions, please post them in the text chat. We will get to them as they come in. We've got time for a question or two. I will actually be running over to the OSPOs and lawyers room to moderate the final McCoy talk of the day. So I won't be here to handle the Q&A, but I'm pretty sure we all have looked at a chat before. So, I mean, thank you everyone for being here. That is to say, we can all work together to solve each other's problems, just like Scott has been talking about. So if you have questions, please post them in the chat.
Or like I said, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and then continue the discussion on Twitter.
Yeah. Why don't we post your Twitter handle in the spot? And Deb, thank you for taking over. I'm going to take my leave.
Thanks, Rami.